Johnny Ludlow, First Series. Part 2. Johnny Ludlow, First Series, 1874, consists of 26 short, self-contained stories. Each chapter explores different events, mysteries, and social issues, with Johnny Ludlow either observing or participating. You can enjoy each story individually, making this series perfect for watching one chapter at a time. Chapter 3. Wolf Barrington's Taming. This is an incident of our school life, one that I never care to look back upon. All of us have sad remembrances of some kind living in the mind, and we are apt in our painful regret to say, if I had but done this, or had but done the other, things might have turned out differently. The school was a large square house, built of rough stone, gardens and playgrounds and fields extending around it. It was called Worcester House, a title of the fancy, I suppose, since it was some miles away from Worcester. The master was Dr. Frost, a tall, stout man, in white frilled shirt, knee breeches and buckles, stern on occasion, but a gentleman to the backbone. He had several undermasters. 40 boys were received. We wore the college cap and Eton jacket. Mrs. Frost was delicate, and Hall, a sour old woman of 50, was manager of the eatables. Todd and I must have been in the school 2 years, I think, when Archie Hearn entered. He was 11 years old. We had seen him at the house sometimes before, and liked him. A regular good little fellow was Archie. Hearn's father was dead. His mother had been a Miss Stockhausen, sister to Mrs. Frost. The Stockhausens had a name in Worcestershire, chiefly, I think, for dying off. There had been 6 sisters, and the only 2 now left were Mrs. Frost and Mrs. Hearn. The other 4 quietly faded away one after another, not living to see 30. Mr. Hearn died from an accident when Archie was only a year old. He left no will, and there ensued a sharp dispute about his property. The Stockhausens said it all belonged to the little son. The Hearn family considered that a portion of it ought to go back to them. The poor widow was the only quiet spirit amongst them, willing to be led either way. What the disputants did was to put it in a chancery, and I don't much think it ever came out again. It was the worst move they could have made for Mrs. Hearn, for it reduced her to a very slender income indeed, and the world wondered how she got on at all. She lived in a cottage about 3 miles from the Frosts, with one servant and the little child Archibald. In the course of years, people seemed to forget all about the property in chancery, and to ignore her as quite a poor woman. Well, I and Todd, had been at Dr. Frost 2 years or so when Archibald Hearn entered the school. He was a slender little lad with bright brown eyes, a delicate face, and pink cheeks, very sweet-tempered and pleasant in manner. At first he used to go home at night, but when the winter weather set and he caught a cough, and then came into the house altogether. Some of the big ones felt sure that old Frost took him for nothing. But as little Hearn was Mrs. Frost's nephew, and we liked her, no talk was made about it. The lad did not much like coming into the house. We could see that. He seemed always to be hankering after his mother and old Betty the servant. Not in words, but he'd stand with his arms on the play-yard gate, his eyes gazing out towards the quarter where the cottage was, as if he would like his sight to penetrate the wood and the 2 or 3 miles beyond, and take a look at it. When any of us said to him as a bit of chaff, "You were staring after old Betty," he would say yes, he wished he could see her and his mother, and then tell no end of tales about what Betty had done for him in his illnesses. Anyway, Hearn was a straightforward little chap and a favorite in the school. He had been with us about a year when Wolf Barrington came. Quite another sort of pupil. A big, strong fellow who had never had a mother, rich and overbearing and cruel. He was in mourning for his father, who had just died, a rich Irishman, given to company and fast living. Wolf came in for all the money, so that he had a fine career before him and might be expected to set the world on fire. Little Hearn's stories had been of home, of his mother and old Betty. Wolf's were different. He had had the run of his father's stables and knew more about horses and dogs than the animals knew about themselves. Curious things, too, he'd tell of men and women who had stayed at old Barrington's place. And what he said of the public school he had been at might have made old Frost's hair stand on end. Why he left the public school we did not find out. Some said he had run away from it, and that his father, who'd indulged him awfully, would not send him back to be punished. Others said the headmaster would not receive him back again. In the nick of time, the father died, and Wolf's guardians put him to Dr. Frost's. "I shall make you my fag," said Barrington, the day he entered, catching hold of little Hern in the playground and twisting him round by the arm. "What's that?" asked Hern, rubbing his arm, for Wolf's grasp had not been a light one. "What's that?" repeated Barrington, scornfully. "What a precious young fool you must be, not to know. Who's your mother?" "She lives over there," answered Hern, taking the question literally and nodding beyond the wood. "Oh," said Barrington, screwing up his mouth. "What's her name? And what's yours?" "Mrs. Hern." "Mine's Archibald." "Good, Mr. Archibald. You shall be my fag. That is, my servant, and you'll do every earthly thing that I order you to do. And mind you do it smartly, or maybe that girl's face of yours will show out rather blue sometimes." "I shall not be anybody's servant," returned Archie in his mild, inoffensive way. "Won't you? You'll tell me another tale before this time tomorrow. Did you ever get licked in a next week?" The child made no answer. He began to think the new fellow might be in earnest, and gazed up at him in doubt. "When you can't see out of your two eyes for the swelling round them, and your back stiff with smarting and aching, that's the kind of licking I mean," went on Barrington. "Did you ever taste it?" "No, sir." "Good again. It will be all the sweeter when you do. Now look you here, Mr. Archibald Hern. I appoint you my fag in ordinary. You'll fetch and carry for me. You'll black my boots and brush my clothes. You'll sit up to wait on me when I go to bed, and read me to sleep. You'll be dressed before I am in the morning, and be ready with my clothes and hot water. Never mind whether the rules of the house are against hot water. You'll have to provide it, though you boil it in the bedroom grate, or out in the nearest field. You'll attend me at my lessons, look out words for me, copy my exercises in a fair hand, and if you were old enough to do them, you'd have to. That's a few of the items, but there are 100 other things that I've not time to detail. If I can get a horse for my use, you'll have to groom him. And if you don't put out your mettle to serve me in all these ways, and don't hold yourself in readiness to fly and obey me at any minute or hour of the day, you'll get daily one of the lickings I've told you of, until you are licked into shape." Barrington meant what he said. Voice and countenance alike wore a determined look, as if his words were law. Lots of the fellows, attracted by the talking, had gathered round. Hern, honest and straightforward himself, did not altogether understand what evil might be in store for him, and grew seriously frightened. The captain of the school walked up, John Whitney. "What is it you say Hern has to do?" he asked. "He knows now," answered Barrington. "That's enough. They don't allow servants here. I must have a fag in place of one." In turning his fascinated eyes from Barrington, Hern saw Blair standing by, our mathematical master, of whom you will hear more later. Blair must have caught what passed, and little Hern appealed to him. "Am I obliged to be his fag, sir?" Mr. Blair put us leisurely aside with his hands and confronted the new fellow. "Your name is Barrington, I think," he said. "Yes, it is," said Barrington, staring at him defiantly. "Allow me to tell you that fags are not permitted here. The system would not be tolerated by Dr. Frost for a moment. Each boy must wait on himself and be responsible for himself, seniors and juniors alike. You are not at a public school now, Barrington. In a day or two, when you shall have learnt the customs and rules here, I dare say you will find yourself quite sufficiently comfortable and see that a fag would be an unnecessary appendage." "Who is that man?" cried Barrington as Blair turned away. "Mathematical master. Sees to us out of hours," answered Bill Whitney. "And what the devil did you mean by making a sneaking appeal to him?" continued Barrington, seizing Hern roughly. "I did not mean it for sneaking, but I could not do what you wanted," said Hern. "He had been listening to us? I wish to goodness that confounded fool, Taptow, had been sunk in his horse pond before he put me to such a place as this," cried Barrington passionately. "As to you, you sneaking little devil, it seems I can't make you do what I wanted, fags being forbidden fruit here, but it shan't serve you much. There's to begin with." Hern got a shake and a kick that sent him flying. Blair was back on the instant. "Are you a coward, Mr. Barrington?" "A coward," retorted Barrington, his eyes flashing. "You had better try whether I am or not. It seems to me that you act like one in attacking a lad so much younger and weaker than yourself. Don't let me have to report you to Dr. Frost the first day of your arrival. Another thing, I must request you to be a little more careful in your language. You have come amidst gentlemen here, not blackguards." The matter ended here, but Barrington looked in a frightful rage. It was unfortunate that it should have occurred the day he entered, but it did so, word for word, as I have written it. It set some of us rather against Barrington, and it set him against Hearn. He didn't lick him in the next week, but he gave him many a blow that the boy did nothing to deserve. Barrington won his way, though, as the time went on. He had a liberal supply of money and was open-handed with it, and he would often do a generous turn for one and another. The worst of him was his roughness. At play he was always rough, and, when put out, savage as well. His strength and activity were something remarkable. He would not have minded hard blows himself, and he showered them out on others with no more care than if we had been made of pumice stone. It was Barrington who introduced the new system at football. We had played it before in a rather mild way, speaking comparatively, but he soon changed that. Dr. Frost got to know of it in time, and he appeared amongst us one day when we were in the thick of it, and stopped the game with a sweep of his hand. They play it at rugby now very much as Barrington made us play it then. The doctor, standing with his face unusually red and his shirt and necktie unusually white and his knee buckles gleaming, asked whether we were a pack of cannibals, that we should kick at one another in that dangerous manner. If we ever attempted it again, he said football should be stopped. So we went back to the old way. But we had tried the new, you see, and the consequence was that a great deal of rough play would creep into it now and again. Barrington led it on. No cannibal, as old Frost put it, could have been more carelessly furious at it than he. To see him with his sallow face in a heat, his keen black eyes flashing, his hat off, and his straight hair flung back, was not the pleasantest sight to my mind. Snep said one day that he looked just like the devil at these times. Wolfe Barrington overheard him and kicked him right over the hillock. I don't think he was ill-intentioned, but his strong frame had been untamed. It required a vent for its superfluous strength. His animal spirits led him away, and he had never been taught to put a curb on himself or his inclinations. One thing was certain, that the name Wolfe, for such a nature as his, was singularly appropriate. Some of us told him so. He laughed in answer, never saying that it was only shortened from Walfrey, his real name, as we learnt later. He could be as good a fellow and comrade as any of them when he chose, and on the whole we liked him a great deal better than we had thought we should at first. As to his animosity against little Hearn, it was wearing off. The lad was too young to retaliate, and Barrington grew tired of knocking him about, perhaps a little ashamed of it when there was no return. In a 12 months' time it had quite subsided, and to the surprise of many of us, Barrington, coming back from a visit to old Taptow, his guardian, brought Hearn a handsome knife with 3 blades as a present. And so it would have gone on, but for an unfortunate occurrence. I shall always say and think so, but for that it might have been peace between them to the end. Barrington, who was defiantly independent, had betaken himself to Evesham, one half-holiday, without leave. He walked straight into some mischief there and broke a street boy's head. Dr. Frost was appealed to by the boy's father, and of course there was a row. The doctor forbade Barrington ever to stir beyond bounds again without first obtaining permission, and Blair had orders that for a fortnight to come Barrington was to be confined to the playground in after hours. Very good. A day or two after that, on the next Saturday afternoon, the school went to a cricket match, doctor, masters, boys, and all, Barrington only being left behind. Was he one to stand this? No. He coolly walked away to the high road, saw a public conveyance passing, hailed it, mounted it, and was carried to Evesham. There he disported himself for an hour or so, visited the chief fruit and tart shops, and then chartered a gig to bring him back to within half a mile of the school. The cricket match was not over when he got in, for it lasted up to the twilight of the summer evening, and no one would have known of the escapade but for one miserable misfortune. Archie Hearn happened to have gone that afternoon to Evesham with his mother. They were passing along the street, and he saw Barrington amidst the sweets. "There's Wolfe Barrington," said Archie, in the surprise of the moment, and would have halted at the tart shop. But Mrs. Hearn, who was in a hurry, did not stop. On the Monday, she brought Archie back to school. He had been at home sick for more than a week and knew nothing of Barrington's punishment. Archie came amongst us at once, But Mrs. Hearn stayed to take tea with her sister and Dr. Frost. Without the slightest intention of making mischief, quite unaware that she was doing so, Mrs. Hearn mentioned incidentally that they had seen one of the boys, Barrington, at Evesham on the Saturday. Dr. Frost pricked up his ears at the news, not believing it, however. But Mrs. Hearn said yes, for Archie had seen him eating tarts at the confectioner's. The doctor finished his tea, went to his study, and sent for Barrington. Barrington denied it. He was not in the habit of telling lies, was too fearless of consequences to do anything of the sort, but he denied it now to the doctor's face. Perhaps he began to think he might have gone a little too far. Dr. Frost rang the bell and ordered Archie Hearn in. "Which shop was Barrington in when you saw him on Saturday?" questioned the doctor. "The pastry cook's," said Archie, innocently. "What was he doing?" blandly went on the doctor. "Oh, no harm, sir. Only eating tarts," Archie hastened to say. Well, it all came out then, and though Archie was quite innocent of willfully telling tales, would have cut out his tongue rather than have said a word to injure Barrington, he received the credit of it now. Barrington took his punishment without a word. The hardest caning old Frost had given for many a long day, and heaps of work besides, and a promise of certain expulsion if he ever again went off surreptitiously in coaches and gigs. But Barrington thrashed Hearn worse when it was over, and branded him with the name of Sneak. "He will never believe otherwise," said Archie, the tears of pain and mortification running down his cheeks, fresh and delicate as a girl's. But I'd give the world not to have gone that afternoon to Evesham. A week or two later we went in for a turn at hare and hounds. Barrington's term of punishment was over then. Snep was the hare, a fleet, wiry fellow who could outrun most of us. But the hare this time came to grief. After doubling and turning, as Snep used to like to do, thinking to throw us off the scent, he sprained his foot trying to leap a hedge and dry ditch beyond it. We were on his trail, whooping and hallooing like mad. He kept quiet, and we passed on and never saw him. But there was no more scent to be seen, and we found we had lost it, and went back. Snep showed up then, and the sport was over for the day. Some went home one way, and some another. All of us were as hot as fire, and thirsting for water. "If you'll turn down here by the great oak tree, we shall come to my mother's house, and you can have as much water as you like," said little Hearn, in his good nature. So we turned down. There were only 6 or 7 of us, for Snep and his damaged foot made one, and most of them had gone on at a quicker pace. Todd helped Snep on one side, Barrington on the other, and he limped along between them. It was a narrow red brick house, a parlor window on each side the door, and 3 windows above, small altogether, but very pretty, with jessamine and clematis climbing up the walls. Archie Hearn opened the door, and we trooped in, without regard to ceremony. Mrs. Hearn, she had the same delicate face as Archie, the same pink color and bright brown eyes, came out of the kitchen to stare at us. As well she might. Her cotton sleeves were turned up to the elbows, her fingers were stained red, and she had a coarse kitchen cloth pinned round her. She was pressing black currants for jelly. We had plenty of water, and Mrs. Hearn made Snep sit down and looked at his foot and put a wet bandage round it, kneeling before him to do it. I thought I had never seen so nice a face as hers, very placid, with a sort of sad look in it. Old Betty, that Hearn used to talk about, appeared in a short blue petticoat and a kind of brown print jacket. I have seen the homely servants in France since dressed very similarly. Snep thanked Mrs. Hearn for giving his foot relief, and we took off our hats to her as we went away. The same night, before Blair called us in for prayers, Archie Hearn heard Barrington giving a sneering account of the visit to some of the fellows in the playground. Just like a cook, you know. Might be taken for one. Some coarse bunting tied round her waist, and hands steeped in red kitchen stuff. "My mother could never be taken for anything but a lady," spoke up Archie bravely. "A lady may make jelly. A great many ladies prefer to do it themselves." "Now you be off," cried Barrington, turning sharply on him. "Keep at a distance from your betters." "There's nobody in the world better than my mother," returned the boy, standing his ground and flushing painfully. For in truth, the small way they were obliged to live in, through Chancery retaining the property, made a sore place in a corner of Archie's heart. Ask Joseph Todditley what he thinks of her. Ask John Whitney. They recognize her for a lady, but then they are gentlemen themselves. It was I who put that in. I couldn't help having a fling at Barrington. A bit of applause followed and stung him. If you shove in your Johnny Ludlow, or presume to interfere with me, I'll pummel you to powder. There, Barrington kicked out on all sides, sending us backward. The bell rang for prayers then, and we had to go in. The game the next evening was football. We went out to it as soon as tea was over, to the field by the river towards Vale Farm. I can't tell much about its progress, except that the play seemed rougher and louder than usual. Once there was a regular skirmish, scores of feet kicking out at once, great struggling, pushing and shouting, and when the ball got off, and the tail after it in full hue and cry, one was left behind lying on the ground. I don't know why I turned my head back. It was the merest chance that I did so, and I saw Todd kneeling on the grass, raising the boy's head. "Holloa," said I, running back. "Anything wrong? Who is it?" It was little Hearn. He had his eyes shut. Todd did not speak. "What's the matter, Todd? Is he hurt?" "Well, I think he's hurt a little," was Todd's answer. "He has had a kick here." Todd touched the left temple with his finger, drawing it down as far as the back of the ear. It must have been a good wide kick, I thought. "It has stunned him, poor little fellow. Can you get some water from the river?" "Johnny, I could if I had anything to bring it in. It would leak out of my straw hat long before I got here." But little Hearn made a move then and opened his eyes. Presently he sat up, putting his hands to his head. Todd was as tender with him as a mother. "How do you feel, Archie?" "Oh, I'm all right, I think. A bit giddy." Getting onto his feet, he looked from me to Todd in a bewildered manner. I thought it odd. He said he wouldn't join the game again, but go in and rest. Todd went with him, ordering me to keep with the players. Hearn walked all right, and did not seem to be much the worse for it. "What's the matter now?" asked Mrs. Hall, in her cranky way, for she happened to be in the yard when they entered, Todd marshalling little Hearn by the arm. "He has had a blow at football," answered Todd. "Here," indicating the place he had shown me. "A kick, I suppose you mean," said Mother Hall. "Yes, if you like to call it so. It was a blow with a foot." "Did you do it, Master Todd, at least?" "No, I did not," retorted Todd. "I wonder the doctor allows that football to be played," she went on, grumbling. "I wouldn't if I kept a school. I know that. It is a barbarous game, only fit for bears. I am all right," put in Hearn. "I needn't have come in, but for feeling giddy." But he was not quite right yet, for without the slightest warning, before he had time to stir from where he stood, he became frightfully sick. Hall ran for a basin and some warm water. Todd held his head. "This is through having gobbled down your tea in such a mortal hurry, to be off to that precious football," decided Hall, resentfully. "The wonder is that the whole crew of you are not sick, swallowing your food at the rate you do." "I think I'll lie on the bed for a bit," said Archie, when the sickness had passed. "I shall be up again by supper time." They went with him to his room. Neither of them had the slightest notion that he was seriously hurt, or that there could be any danger. Archie took off his jacket and lay down in his clothes. Mrs. Hall offered to bring him up a cup of tea, but he said it might make him sick again, and he'd rather be quiet. She went down, and Todd sat on the edge of the bed. Archie shut his eyes and kept still. Todd thought he was dropping off to sleep and began to creep out of the room. The eyes opened then, and Archie called to him. "Todd, at least?" "I am here, old fellow." "What is it?" "You'll tell him I forgive him," said Archie, speaking in an earnest whisper. "Tell him I know he didn't think to hurt me." "Oh, I'll tell him," answered Todd lightly. "And be sure give my dear love to Mama." "So I will. And now I'll go to sleep, or I shan't be down to supper. You will come and call me if I am not, won't you?" "All right," said Todd, tucking the counterpane about him. "Are you comfortable, Archie?" "Quite. Thank you." Todd came onto the field again and joined the game. It was a little less rough, and there were no more mishaps. We got home later than usual, and supper stood on the table. The suppers at Worcester House were always the same, bread and cheese. And not too much of it. Half a round off the loaf, with a piece of cheese for each fellow, and a drop of beer or water. Our other meals were good and abundant, but the doctor waged war with heavy suppers. If old Hall had had her way, We should have had none at all. Little Hearn did not appear, and Todd went up to look after him. I followed. Opening the door without noise, we stood listening and looking. Not that there was much good in looking, for the room was in darkness. "Archie," whispered Todd. No answer. No sound. "Are you asleep, old fellow?" Not a word still. The dead might be there, for all the sound there was. "He's asleep for certain," said Todd, groping his way towards the bed. "So much the better, poor little chap. I won't wake him." It was a small room, 2 beds in it. Archie's was the one at the end by the wall. Todd groped his way to it, and in thinking of it afterwards, I wondered that Todd did go up to him. The most natural thing would have been to come away and shut the door. Instinct must have guided him, as it guides us all. Todd bent over him, touching his face, I think. I stood close behind. Now that our eyes were accustomed to the darkness, it seemed a bit lighter. Something like a cry from Todd made me start. In the dark, and holding the breath, one is easily startled. "Get a light, Johnny. A light, quick! For the love of heaven." I believe I leaped the stairs at a bound. I believe I knocked over Mother Hall at the foot. I know I snatched the candle that was in her hand, and she screamed after me as if I had murdered her. "Here it is, Todd." He was at the door waiting for it, every atom of color gone clean out of his face. Carrying it to the bed, he let its light fall full on Archie Hearn. The face was white and cold, the mouth covered with froth. "Oh, Todd, what is it that's the matter with him?" "Hush, Johnny. I fear he's dying." "Good Lord, to think we should have been such ignorant fools as to leave him by himself. As not have sent for Featherstone." We were down again in a moment. Hall stood scolding still, demanding her candle. Todd said a word that silenced her. She backed against the wall. "Don't play your tricks on me, Mr. Toddetley." "Go and see," said Todd. She took the light from his hand quietly and went up. Just then, the doctor and Mrs. Frost, who had been walking all the way home from Sir John Whitney's, where they had spent the evening, came in and learnt what had happened. Featherstone was there in no time, so to say, and shut himself into the bedroom with the doctor and Mrs. Frost and Hall, and I don't know how many more. Nothing could be done for Archibald Hearn. He was not quite dead, but close upon it. He was dead before anyone thought of sending to Mrs. Hearn. It came to the same. Could she have come upon telegraph wires, she would still have come too late. When I look back upon that evening, and a good many years have gone by since then, nothing arises in my mind but a picture of confusion, tinged with a feeling of terrible sorrow, aye, and of horror. If a death happens in a school, it is generally kept from the pupils, as far as possible. At any rate, they are not allowed to see any of its attendant stir and details. But this was different. Upon masters and boys, upon mistress and household, it came with the same startling shock. Dr. Frost said feebly that the boys ought to go up to bed, and then Blair told us to go, but the boys stayed on where they were, hanging about the passages, stealing upstairs and peeping into the room, questioning Featherstone when we could get the chance of coming upon him, as to whether Hearn would get well or not. No one checked us. I went in once. Mrs. Frost was alone, kneeling by the bed. I thought she must have been saying a prayer. Just then she lifted her head to look at him. As I backed away again, she began to speak aloud. And oh, what a sad tone she said it in. The only son of his mother. And she was a widow. There had to be an inquest. It did not come to much. The most that could be said was that he died from a kick at football. A most unfortunate, but an accidental kick, quoth the coroner. Todd had said that he saw the kick given. That is, had seen some foot come flat down with a bang on the side of little Hearn's head. And when Todd was asked if he recognized the foot, he replied no, boots looked very much alike, and a great many were thrust out in the skirmish, all kicking together. Not one would own to having given it. For the matter of that, the fellow might not have been conscious of what he did. No end of thoughts glanced towards Barrington, both because he was so ferocious at the game, and that he had a spite against Hearn. "I never touched him," said Barrington, when this leaked out, and his face and voice were boldly defiant. "It wasn't me. I never so much as saw that Hearn was down, and as there were others quite as brutal at football as Barrington, he was believed. We could not get over it any way. It seemed so dreadful that he should have been left alone to die. Hall was chiefly to blame for that, and it cowed her. "Look here," said Todd to us. "I have a message for one of you. Whichever the cap fits may take it to himself. When Hearn was dying, he told me to say that he forgave the fellow who kicked him." This was the evening of the inquest day. We had all gathered in the porch by the stone bench, and Todd took the opportunity to relate what he had not related before. He repeated every word that Hearn had said. "Did Hearn know who it was then?" asked John Whitney. "I think so." "Then why didn't you ask him to name him?" "Why didn't I ask him to name him?" repeated Todd in a fume. "Do you suppose I thought he was going to die, Whitney? Or that the kick was to turn out a serious one? Hearn was growing big enough to fight his own battles, and I never thought but he would be up again at supper time." John Whitney pushed his hair back in his quiet, thoughtful way and said no more. He was to die, himself, the following year, but that has nothing to do with the present matter. I was standing away at the gate after this, looking at the sunset, when Todd came up and put his arms on the top bar. "What are you gazing at, Johnny?" "At the sunset. How red it is? I was thinking that if Hearn's up there now, he is better off. It is very beautiful. I should not like to have been the one to send him there, though," was Todd's answer. "Johnny, I am certain Hearn knew who it was," he went on in a low tone. "I am certain he thought the fellow, himself, knew, and that it had been done for the purpose. I think I know also." "Tell us," I said, and Todd glanced over his shoulders to make sure no one was within hearing before he replied. "Wolf Barrington." "Why don't you accuse him, Todd?" "It wouldn't do, and I am not absolutely sure. What I saw was this. In the rush, one of them fell. I saw his head lying on the ground. Before I could shout out to the fellows to take care, a boot with a gray trouser over it came stamping down, not kicking, on the side of the head. If ever anything was done deliberately, that stamp seemed to be. It could hardly have been chance. I know no more than that. It all passed in a moment. I didn't see that it was Barrington. But what other fellow is there among us who would have willfully harmed little Hearn? It is that thought that brings conviction to me." I looked round to where a lot of them stood at a distance. "Wolf has got on gray trousers, too." "That does not tell much," returned Todd. "Half of us were the same. Yours are gray. Mine are gray. It's just this. While I am convinced in my own mind that it was Barrington, there's no sort of proof that it was so, and he denies it. So it must rest and die away. Keep counsel, Johnny." The funeral took place from the school. All of us went to it. In the evening, Mrs. Hearn, who had been staying at the house, surprised us by coming into the tea room. She looked very small in her black gown. Her thin cheeks were more flushed than usual, and her eyes had a great sadness in them. "I wish to say good-bye to you, and to shake hands with you before I go home," she began in a kind tone, and we all got up from the table to face her. "I thought you would like me to tell you that I feel sure it must have been an accident, that no harm was intended. My dear little son said this to Joseph Todditley when he was dying, and I fancy that some provision of death must have lain then upon his spirit and caused him to say it, though he himself might not have been quite conscious of it. He died in love and peace with all, and if he had anything to forgive, he forgave freely. I wish to let you know that I do the same. Only try to be a little less rough at play, and God bless you all. Will you shake hands with me?" John Whitney, a true gentleman always, went up to her first, meeting her offered hand. "If it had been anything but an accident, Mrs. Hearn," he began in tones of deep feeling. "If any one of us had done it willfully, I think, standing to hear you now, we should shrink to the earth in our shame and contrition. You cannot regret Archibald much more than we do. In the midst of my grief, I know one thing, that God has taken him from a world of care to peace and happiness. I try to rest in that. Thank you all. Goodbye." Catching her breath, she shook hands with us one by one, giving each a smile, but did not say more. And the only one of us who did not feel her visit as it was intended was Barrington. But he had no feeling. His body was too strong for it, his temper too fierce. He would have thrown a sneer of ridicule after her, but Whitney hissed it down. Before another day had gone over, Barrington and Todd had a row. It was about a crib. Todd could be as overbearing as Barrington when he pleased, and he was cherishing ill feeling towards him. They went and had it out in private, but it did not come to a fight. Todd was not one to keep in matters till they rankled, and he openly told Barrington that he believed it was he who had caused Hearn's death. Barrington denied it out and out, first of all swearing passionately that he had not, and then calming down to talk about it quietly. Todd felt less sure of it after that, as he confided to me in the bedroom. Dr. Frost forbid football, and the time went on. What I have further to relate may be thought a made-up story, such as we find in fiction. It is so very like a case of retribution, but it is all true and happened as I shall put it. And somehow I never care to dwell long upon the calamity. It was as nearly as possible a year after Hearn died. Jessup was captain of the school, for John Whitney was too ill to come. Jessup was almost as rebellious as Wolfe, and the two would ridicule Blair and call him baked pie to his face. One morning, when they had given no end of trouble to old Frost over their Greek, and laid the blame upon the hot weather, the doctor said he had a great mind to keep them in until dinner time. However, they ate humble pie and were allowed to escape. Blair was taking us for a walk. Instead of keeping with the ranks, Barrington and Jessup fell out and sat down on the gate of a field where the wheat was being carried. Blair said they might sit there if they pleased, but forbid them to cross the gate. Indeed, there was a standing interdiction against our entering any field whilst the crops were being gathered. We went on and left them. Half an hour afterwards, before we got back, Barrington had been carried home, dying as was supposed. He and Jessup had disobeyed Blair, disregarded orders, and rushed into the field, shouting and leaping like a couple of mad fellows, as the laborers afterwards said. Making for the wagon, laden high with wheat, they mounted it and started on the horses. In some way, Barrington lost his balance, slipped over the side, and the hind wheel went over him. I shall never forget the house when we got back. Jessup, in his terror, had made off for his home, running most of the way, 7 miles. He was in the same boat as Wolfe, except that he escaped injury, had gone over the stile in defiance of orders, and got on the wagon. Barrington was lying in the blue room, and Mrs. Frost, frightened out of bed, stood on the landing in her nightcap, a shawl wrapped round her loose white dressing gown. She was ill at the time. Featherstone came striding up the road, wiping his hot face. "Lord bless me," cried Featherstone when he had looked at Wolfe and touched him. "I can't deal with this single-handed, Dr. Frost." The doctor had guessed that, and Roger was already away on a galloping horse, flying for another. He brought Little Pink, a shrimp of a man with a fair reputation in his profession. But the two were more accustomed to treating rustic ailments than grave cases, and Dr. Frost knew that. Evening drew on, and the dusk was gathering, when a carriage with post-horses came thundering in at the front gates, bringing Mr. Carden. They did not give to us boys the particulars of the injuries, and I don't know them to this day. The spine was hurt, the right ankle smashed, we heard that much. Tapdell, Barrington's guardian, came over, and an uncle from London. Altogether, it was a miserable time. The masters seized upon it to be doubly stern, and read us lectures upon disobedience and rebellion, as though we had been the offenders. As to Jessup, his father handed him back again to Dr. Frost, saying that in his opinion a taste of birch would much conduce to his benefit. Barrington did not seem to suffer as keenly as some might have done. Perhaps his spirits kept him up, for they were untamed. On the very day after the accident, he asked for some of the fellows to go in and sit with him, because he was dull. By and by, the doctor said, and the next day, but one, Dr. Frost sent me in. The paid nurse sat at the end of the room. "Oh, it's you, is it, Ludlow? Where's Jessup?" "Jessup's under punishment." His face looked the same as ever, and that was all that could be seen of him. He lay on his back covered over. As to the low bed, it might have been a board, to judge by its flatness. And perhaps was so. "I am very sorry about it, Barrington. We all are. Are you in much pain?" "Oh, I don't know," was his impatient answer. "One has to grin and bear it. The cursed idiots had stacked the wheat sloping to the sides, or it would never have happened." "What do you hear about me?" "Nothing but regret that it—" "I don't mean that stuff." "Regret indeed. Regret won't undo it. I mean as to my getting about again. Will it be ages first? We don't hear a word. If they were to keep me here a month, Ludlow, I should go mad. Rampant. You shut up, old woman." For the nurse had interfered, telling him he must not excite himself. "My ankle's hurt, but I believe it is not half as bad as a regular fracture, and my back's bruised." "Well, what's a bruise?" "Nothing. Of course there's pain and stiffness and all that, but so there's after a bad fight or a thrashing. And they talk about my lying here for 3 or 4 weeks. Catch me? One thing was evident. They had not allowed Wolf to suspect the gravity of the case. Downstairs we had an inkling, I don't remember whence gathered, that it might possibly end in death. There was a suspicion of some internal injury that we could not get to know of. And it is said that even Mr. Carden, with all his surgical skill, could not get at it either. Anyway, the prospect of recovery for Barrington was supposed to be of the scantiest, and it threw a gloom over us. A sad mishap was to occur. Of course, no one in their senses would have let Barrington learn the danger he was in, especially while there was just a chance that the peril would be surmounted. I read a book lately. Johnny Ludlow, where a little child met with an accident, and the first thing the people around him did, father, doctors, nurses, was to inform him that he would be a cripple for the rest of his days. That was common sense with a vengeance, and about as likely to occur in real life as that I could turn myself into a Dutchman. However, something of the kind did happen in Barrington's case, but through inadvertence. Another uncle came over from Ireland, an old man, and in talking with Featherstone he spoke out too freely. They were outside Barrington's door, and besides that, supposed that he was asleep. But he had awakened then, and heard more than he ought. The Blue Room always seemed to have an echo in it. "So it's all up with me, Ludlow?" I was by his bedside when he suddenly said this, in the twilight of the summer evening. He had been lying quite silent since I entered, and his face had a white, still look on it, never before noticed there. "What do you mean, Barrington? None of your shamming here. I know, and so do you, Johnny Ludlow. I say, though it makes one feel queer to find the world slipping away. I had looked for so much jolly life in it. Barrington, you may get well yet. You may indeed. Ask Pink and Featherstone, else when they next come, ask Mr. Carden. I can't think what idea you have been getting hold of." "There, that's enough," he answered. "Don't bother. I want to be quiet." He shut his eyes, and the darkness grew as the minutes passed. Presently someone came into the room with a gentle step, a lady in a black and white gown that didn't rustle. It was Mrs. Hearn. Barrington looked up at her. "I'm going to stay with you for a day or two," she said in a low, sweet voice, bending over him and touching his forehead with her cool fingers. "I hear you have taken a dislike to the nurse, and Mrs. Frost is really too weakly just now to get about." "She's a sly cat," said Barrington, alluding to the nurse, "and watches me out of the tail of her eye. Hall's as bad. They are in league together. Well, they shall not come in more than I can help. I will nurse you myself." "No, not you," said Barrington, his face looking red and uneasy. "I'll not trouble you." She sat down in my chair, just pressing my hand in token of greeting, and I left them. In the ensuing days his life trembled in the balance, and even when part of the more immediate danger was surmounted, part of the worst of the pain, it was still a toss-up. Barrington had no hope whatever. I don't think Mrs. Hearn had either. She hardly left him. At first he seemed to resent her presence, to wish her away, to receive unwillingly what she did for him. But in spite of himself he grew to look round for her, and to let his hand lie in hers whenever she chose to take it. Who can tell what she said to him? Who can know how she softly and gradually awoke the better feelings within him, and won his heart from its hardness? She did do it, and that's enough. The way was paved for her. What the accident had not done, the fear of death had. Tamed him. One evening when the sun had sunk, leaving only a fading light in the western sky, and Barrington had been watching it from his bed, he suddenly burst into tears. Mrs. Hearn, busy amongst the physic bottles, was by his side in a moment. "Wolf! It's very hard to have to die." "Hush, my dear. You're not worse, a little better. I think you may be spared. I do indeed. And, in any case, you know what I read to you this evening, that to die is gain. Yes, for some. I've never had my thoughts turned that way. They're turned now. That is quite enough. It is such a little while to have lived," went on Barrington, after a pause. "Such a little while to have enjoyed earth. What are my few years compared with the ages that have gone by, with the ages and ages that are to come? Nothing. Not as much as a drop of water to the ocean. Wolf, dear, if you live out the allotted years of man, 70, What would even that be in comparison? As you say, nothing. It seems to me that our well-being or ill-being here need not much concern us. The days, whether short or long, will pass as a dream. Eternal life lasts forever. Soon we must all be departing for it. Wolf made no answer. The clear sky was assuming its pale tints, shading off one into another, and his eyes were looking at them. But it was as if he saw nothing. Listen, my dear. When Archibald died, I thought I should have died of grief and pain. I grieved to think how short had been his span of life on this fair earth. How cruel his fate in being taken from it so early. But, oh, Wolf, God has shown me my mistake. I would not have him back again if I could. Wolf put up his hand to cover his face. Not a word spoke he. I wish you could see things as I see them, now that they have been cleared from me, she resumed. It is so much better to be in heaven than on earth. We, who are here, have to battle with cares and crosses, and shall have to do so to the end. Archie has thrown off all care. He is in happiness amidst the redeemed. The room was growing dark. Wolf's face was one of intense pain. Wolf, dear, do not mistake me. Do not think me hard if I say that you would be happier there than here. There is nothing to dread, dying in Christ. Believe me, I would not for the world have Archie back again. How could I then make sure what the eventual ending would be? You and he will know each other up there. Don't, said Wolf. Don't what? Wolf drew her hand close to his face, and she knelt down to catch his whisper. I killed him. A pause, and a sort of sob in her throat. Then, drawing away her hand, she laid her cheek to his. My dear, I think I have known it. You have known it, stammered Wolf in disbelief. Yes, I thought it was likely. I felt nearly sure of it. Don't let it trouble you now. Archie forgave, you know, and I forgave, and God will forgive. How could you come here to nurse me, knowing that? It made me the more anxious to come. You have no mother. No, Wolf was sobbing bitterly. She died when I was born. I've never had anybody. I've never had a chapter read to me, or a prayer prayed. No, dear. And Archie, oh, Archie had all that. From the time he could speak, I tried to train him for heaven. It has seemed to me, since, just as though I had foreseen he would go early and was preparing him for it. I never meant to kill him, sobbed Wolf. I saw his head down, and I put my foot upon it without a moment's thought. If I had taken thought or known it would hurt him seriously, I wouldn't have done it. He is better off, dear, was all she said. You have that comfort. Anyway, I am paid out for it. At the best, I suppose I shall go upon crutches for life. That's bad enough, but dying's worse. Mrs. Hearn, I am not ready to die. Be you very sure God will not take you until you are ready. If you only wish and hope to be made so from your very heart, she whispered. I pray to him often for you, Wolf. I think you must be one of heaven's angels, said Wolf, with a burst of emotion. No, dear. Only a weak woman. I have had so much sorrow and care, trial upon trial, one disappointment after another, that it has left me nothing but heaven to lean upon. Wolf, I'm trying to show you a little bit of the way there. And I do indeed that this accident, which seems and is so dreadful, may have been sent by God in mercy. Perhaps else you might never have found him. And where would you have been in all that long, long eternity? A few years here, never-ending ages hereafter. Oh, Wolf, bear up bravely for the little span, even though the cross may be heavy. Fight on manfully for the real life to come. If you will help me, to be sure I will. Wolf got about again and came out upon crutches. After a while they were discarded, first one, then the other, and he took permanently to a stick. He would never go without that. He would never run or leap again, or kick much either. The doctors looked upon it as a wonderful cure, and old Featherstone was apt to talk to us boys as if it were he who had pulled him through. But not in Henry Carden's hearing. The uncles and Tapdales said he would be better now at a private tutor's. But Wolf would not leave Dr. Frost's. A low pony carriage was bought for him, and all his spare time he would go driving over to Mrs. Hearn's. He was as a son to her. His great animal spirits had been taken out of him, you see, and he had to find his happiness in quieter grooves. One Saturday afternoon he drove me over. Mrs. Hearn had asked me to stay with her until the Monday morning. Barrington generally stayed. It was in November, considerably more than a year after the accident. The guns of the sportsmen were heard in the wood. A pack of hounds and their huntsman rode past the cottage at a gallop, in full chase after a late find. Barrington looked and listened, a sigh escaping him. "These pleasures are barred to me now, but a better one has been open to you," said Mrs. Hearn, with a meaning smile, as she took his hand in hers. And on Wolfe's face, when he glanced at her in answer, there sat a look of satisfied rest that I am sure had never been seen on it before he fell off the wagon. Chapter 2. Major Perifer. He was one of the worst magistrates that ever sat upon the bench of justices. Strangers were given to wonder how he got his commission. But, you see, men are fit or unfit for a post according to their doings in it, and, generally speaking, people cannot tell what those doings will be beforehand. They called him Major Perifer, but he only held rank in a militia regiment, and everyone knows what that is. He had bought the place he lived in some years before, and christened it Perifer Hall. The worst title he could have hit upon, seeing that the good old hall, with a good old family in it, was only a mile or two distant. Perifer Hall was only a stone's throw, so to say, beyond our village, Church Dykeley. They lived at a high rate. Money was not wanting. The Major, his wife, 6 daughters, and a son who did not come home very much. Mrs. Perifer was stuck up. It is one of our county sayings, and it applied to her. When she called on people, her silk gowns rustled as if lined with buckram. Her voice was loud, her manner patronizing. The Major's voice and manner were the same, and the girls took after them. Close by, at the corner of Pyfinch Lane, was a cottage that belonged to me. To me, Johnny Ludlow. Not that I had as yet control over that or any other cottage I might possess. George Reed rented the cottage. It stood in a good large garden which touched Major Perifer's side fence. On the other side the garden, a high hedge divided it from the lane, but it had only a low hedge in front with a low gate in the middle. Trim, well-kept hedges. George Reed took care of that. There was quite a history attaching to him. His father had been indoor servant at the court. When he married and left it, my grandfather gave him a lease of this cottage, renewable every 7 years. George was the only son, had been very decently educated, but turned out wild when he grew up and got out of everything. The result was that he was only a day laborer and never likely to be anything else. He took to the cottage after old Reed's death and worked for Mr. Sterling, who had the court now. George Reed was generally civil, but uncommonly independent. His first wife had died, leaving a daughter, Kathy. Later on he married again. Reed's wild oats had been sown years ago. He was thoroughly well-conducted and industrious now, working in his own garden early and late. When Kathy's mother died, she was taken to by an aunt who lived near Worcester. At 15, she came home again, for the aunt had died. Her 10 years' training there had done very little for her, except make her into a pretty girl. Kathy had been trained to idleness, but to very little else. She could sing, self-taught of course. She could embroider handkerchiefs and frills. She could write a tolerable letter without many mistakes, and was great at reading, especially when the literature was of the halfpenny kind issued weekly. These acquirements, except the last, were not bad things in themselves, but quite unsuited to Kathy Reed's condition and her future prospects in life. The best that she could aspire to, the best her father expected for her, was that of entering on a light, respectable service, and later to become, perhaps, a laborer's wife. The second Mrs. Reed, a quiet kind of young woman, had one little girl only when Kathy came home. She was almost struck dumb when she found what had been Kathy's acquirements in the way of usefulness, or rather, what were her deficiencies. The facts unfolded themselves by degrees. "Your father thinks he'd like you to get a service with some of the gentlefolks, Kathy," her stepmother said to her. "Perhaps at the court, if they can make room for you, or over at Squire Toddley's. Meanwhile, you'll help me with the work at home for a few weeks first. Won't you, dear? When another little one comes, there'll be a good deal on my hands." "Oh, I'll help," answered Kathy, who was a good-natured, ready-speaking girl. "That's right. Can you wash?" "No," said Kathy, with a very decisive shake of the head. "Not wash? Oh dear, no. Can you iron?" "Pocket handkerchiefs." Your aunt was a seamstress. Can you sew well? I don't like sewing. Mrs. Reed looked at her, but said no more then, rather leaving practice instead of theory to develop Kathy's capabilities. But when she came to put her to the test, she found Kathy could not, or would not, do any kind of useful work whatever. Kathy could not wash, iron, scour, cook, or sweep, or even sew plain coarse things such as are required in laborers' families. Kathy could do several kinds of fancy work. Kathy could idle away her time at the glass, oiling her hair, and dressing herself to the best advantage. Kathy had a smattering of history and geography and chronology, and of polite literature, as comprised in the pages of the aforesaid halfpenny and penny weekly romances. The aunt had sent Kathy to a cheap day school where such learning was supposed to be taught, had let her run about when she ought to have been cooking and washing. And of course Kathy had acquired a distaste for work. Mrs. Reed sat down aghast, her hands falling helpless on her lap, a kind of fear of what might be Kathy's future stealing into her heart. Child, what is to become of you? Kathy had no qualms upon the point herself. She gave a laughing kiss to the little child, toddling round the room by the chairs, and took out of her pocket one of those halfpenny serials, whose thrilling stories of brigands and captive damsels she had learned to make her chief delight. I shall have to teach her everything, sighed disappointed Mrs. Reed. Catherine, I don't think the kind of useless things your aunt has taught you are good for poor folk like us. Good. Mrs. Reed might have gone a little further. She began her instruction, but Kathy would not learn. Kathy was always good-humored, but of work she would do none. If she attempted it, Mrs. Reed had to do it over again. Where on earth will the gentlefolks get their servants from, if the girls are to be like you? Cried honest Mrs. Reed. Well, time went on a year or two. Kathy Reed tried 2 or 3 services, but did not keep them. Young Mrs. Sterling at the court at length took her. In 3 months Kathy was home again, as usual. I do not think Catherine will be kept anywhere, Mrs. Sterling said to her stepmother. When she ought to have been minding the baby, the nurse would find her with a strip of embroidery in her hand, or buried in the pages of some bad story that can only do her harm. Kathy was turned 17 when the warfare set in between her father and Major Perifer. The Major suddenly cast his eyes on the little cottage outside his own land and coveted it. Before this, young Perifer, a harmless young man with no whiskers and sandy hair parted down the middle, had struck up an acquaintance with Kathy. When he left Oxford, where he got plucked twice, and at length took his name off the books, he would often be seen leaning over the cottage gate, talking to Kathy in the garden, with the 2 little half-sisters that she pretended to mind. There was no harm, but perhaps Major Perifer feared it might grow into it, and he badly wanted the plot of ground, that he might pull down the cottage and extend his own boundaries to Pyefinch Lane. One fine day in the holidays, when Todd and I were indoors making flies for fishing, our old servant, Thomas, appeared and said that George Reed had come over and wanted to speak to me, which set us wondering, what could he want with me? Show him in here, said Todd. Reed came in, a tall, powerful man of 40, with dark, curling hair and a determined, good-looking face. He began saying that he had heard Major Perifer was after his cottage, wanting to buy it. So he had come over to beg me to interfere and stop the sale. Why, Reed? What can I do? I asked. You know I have no power. You wouldn't turn me out of it yourself, I know, sir. That I wouldn't, neither would I. I like George Reed, and I remembered that he used to have me in his arms sometimes when I was a little fellow at the court. Once he carried me to my mother's grave in the churchyard, and told me she had gone to live in heaven. When a rich gentleman sets his mind on a poor man's bit of a cottage and says, "That shall be mine," the poor man has not much chance against him, sir, unless he that owns the cottage will be his friend. I know you have no power at present, Master Johnny, but if you'd speak to Mr. Brandon, perhaps he would listen to you. Sit down, Reed, interrupted Todd, putting his catgut out of hand. I thought you had the cottage on a lease. And so I have, sir, but the lease will be out at Michaelmas next, and Mr. Brandon can turn me from it if he likes. My father and mother died there, sir. My wife died there. My children were born there. And the place is as much like my homestead as if it was my own. How do you know old Perifer wants it? Continued Todd. I have heard it from a safe source. I've heard, too, that his lawyer and Mr. Brandon's lawyer have settled the matter between their two selves and don't intend to let me as much as know I'm to go out till the time comes, for fear I should make a row over it. Nobody on earth can stop it except Mr. Brandon, added Reed with energy. Have you spoken to Mr. Brandon, Reed? No, sir. I was going up to him, but the thought took me that I'd better come off at once to Master Ludlow. His word might be of more avail than mine. There's no time to be lost. If once the lawyers get Mr. Brandon's consent, he may not be able to recall it. What does Perifer want with the cottage? I fancy he covets the bit of garden, sir. He sees the order I've brought it into. If it's not that, I don't know what it can be. The cottage can be no eyesore to him. He can't see it from his windows. Shall I go with you, Johnny? Said Todd, as Reed went home, after drinking the ale old Thomas had given him. We will circumvent that Perifer, if there's law or justice in the Brandon land. We went off to Mr. Brandon's in the pony carriage, Todd driving. He lived near Ulster and had the management of my property whilst I was a minor. As we went along, who should ride past, meeting us but Major Perifer. Looking like the bulldog that he is, cried Todd, who could not bear the man. Johnny, what will you lay that he has not been to Mr. Brandon's? The negotiations are becoming serious. Todd did not go in. On second thought, he said it might be better to leave it to me. The squire must try if I failed. Mr. Brandon was at home, and Todd drove on into Ulster by way of passing the time. But I don't think you can see him, said the housekeeper when she came to me in the drawing room. This is one of his bad days. A gentleman called just now, and I went into the master, but it was of no use. I know. It was Major Perifer. We thought he might have been calling here. Mr. Brandon was thin and little, with a shriveled face. He lived alone, except for 3 or 4 servants, and always fancied himself ill with one ailment or another. When I went in, for he said he'd see me, he was sitting in an easy chair with a geranium-colored Turkish cap on his head and 2 bottles of medicine at his elbow. Well, Johnny, an invalid as usual, you see. And what is it you so particularly want? I want to ask you a favor, Mr. Brandon, if you'll be good enough to grant it me. What is it? You know that cottage, sir, at the corner of Pyfinch Lane? George Reed's. Well, I have come to ask you not to let it be sold. Who wants to sell it? Asked he, after a pause. Major Perifer wants to buy it, and to turn Reed out. The lawyers are going to arrange it. Mr. Brandon pushed the cap up on his brow and gave the tassel over his ear a twirl as he looked at me. People thought him incapable, but it was only because he had no work to do that he seemed so. He would get a bit irritable sometimes, very rarely though, and he had a squeaky voice, but he was a good and just man. How did you hear this, Johnny? I told him all about it, what Reed had said, and of our having met the major on horseback as we drove along. He came here, but I did not feel well enough to see him, said Mr. Brandon. Johnny, you know that I stand in place of your father, as regards your property, to do the best I can with it. Yes, sir, and I am sure you do it. If Major Perifer, I don't like the man, broke off Mr. Brandon, but that's neither here nor there. At the last magistrates' meeting I attended, he was so overbearing as to shut us all up. My nerves were unstrung for 24 hours afterwards, and Squire Toddley came home swearing. I could not help putting in. Ah, said Mr. Brandon. Yes, some people can throw bile off in that way. I can't. But, Johnny, all that goes for nothing in regard to the matter in hand. And I was about to point out to you that if Major Perifer has set his mind upon buying Reed's cottage and the bit of land attached to it, he is no doubt prepared to offer a good price. More, probably, than it is worth. If so, I should not, in your interests, be justified in refusing this. I could feel my face flush with the sense of injustice, and the tears come into my eyes. They call me a muff for many things. I would not touch the money myself, sir. And if you used it for me, I'm sure it would never bring any good. What's that, Johnny? Money got by oppression or injustice never does. There was a fellow at school. Never mind the fellow at school. Go on with your own argument. To turn Reed out of the place where he has always lived, out of the garden he has done so well by, just because a rich man wants to get possession of it, would be fearfully unjust, sir. It would be as bad as the story of Naboth's vineyard that we heard read in church last Sunday for the first lesson. Todd said so as we came along. Who's Todd? Joseph Toddley. If you turn Reed out, sir, for the sake of benefiting me, I should be ashamed to look people in the face when they talked of it. If you please, sir, I do not think my father would allow it if he were living. Reed says the place is like his homestead. Mr. Brandon measured 2 tablespoonfuls of medicine into a glass, drank it off, and ate a French plum afterwards. The plums were on a plate, and he handed them to me. I took one and tried to crack the stone. You have taken up a strong opinion on this matter, Master Johnny. Yes, sir. I like Reed, and if I did not, he has no more right to be turned out of his home than Major Perifer has out of his. How would he like it if some rich and powerful man came down on his place and turned him out? Major Perifer can't be turned out of his, Johnny. It is his own, and Reed's place is mine, sir, if you won't be angry with me for saying it. Please don't let it be done, Mr. Brandon. The pony carriage came rattling up at this juncture, and we saw Todd look at the windows impatiently. I got up, and Mr. Brandon shook hands with me. What you have said is all very good, Johnny, right in principle, but I cannot let it quite outweigh your interests. When this proposal shall be put before me, as you say it will be, it must have my full consideration. I stopped when I got to the door and turned to look at him. If he would only have given me an assurance. He read in my face what I wanted. No, Johnny, I can't do that. You may go home easy for the present, however, for I will promise not to accept the offer to purchase without first seeing you again and showing you my reasons. I may have gone back to school, sir. I tell you I will see you again if I decide to accept the offer, he repeated emphatically. And I went out to the pony chaise. Old Brandon means to sell, said Todd, when I told him, and he gave the pony an angry cut that made him fly off at a gallop. Will anybody believe that I never heard another word upon the subject, except what people said in the way of gossip? It was soon known that Mr. Brandon had declined to sell the cottage, and when his lawyer wrote him word that the sum offered for it was increased to quite an unprecedented amount, considering the value of the cottage and garden in question, Mr. Brandon only sent a peremptory note back again, saying he was not in the habit of changing his decisions, and the place was not for sale. Todd threw up his hat. Bravo, old Brandon. I thought he'd not go quite over to the enemy. George Reed wanted to thank me for it. One evening, in passing his cottage on my way home from the court, I leaned over the gate to speak to his little ones. He saw me and came running out. The rays of the setting sun shone on the children's white corded bonnets. I have to thank you for this, sir. They are going to renew my lease. Are they? All right, but you need not thank me. I know nothing about it. George Reed gave a decisive nod. If you hadn't got the ear of Mr. Brandon, sir, I know what box I should have been in now. Look at them girls. It was not a very complimentary mode of speech, as applied to the Misses Perifer. 3 of them were passing, dressed outrageously in the fashion as usual. I lifted my straw hat, and one of them nodded in return, but the other 2 only looked out of the tail of their eyes. The Major has been trying it on with me now, remarked Reed, watching them out of sight. When he found he could not buy the place, he thought he'd try and buy out me. He wanted the bit of land for a kitchen garden, he said, and would give me a 5-pound banknote to go out of it. Much obliged, Major, I said, but I'd not go for 50, as if he had not heaps of land himself to make kitchen gardens of. But don't you see, Master Johnny, to a man like Major Perifer, who thinks the world was made for him, there's nothing so mortifying as being balked. He set his mind upon this place. He can't get it, and he is just boiling over. He'd poison me if he could. Now then, what's wanted? Kathy had come up with her pretty dark eyes, whispering some question to her father. I ran on. It was growing late, and the manor ever so far off. From that time the feud grew between Major Perifer and George Reed. Not openly, not actively. It could not well be either when their relative positions were so different. Major Perifer was a wealthy landed proprietor, a county magistrate, and an awfully overbearing one. And George Reed was a poor Katager who worked for his bread as a day laborer. But that the Major grew to abhor and hate Reed, that the man, inhabiting the place at his very gates in spite of him, and looking at him independently, as if to say he knew it, every time he passed, had become an eyesore to him, was easily seen. The Major resented it on us all. He was rude to Mr. Brandon when they met. He struck out his whip once when he was on horseback, and I passed him as if he would like to strike me. I don't know whether he was aware of my visit to Mr. Brandon, but the cottage was mine. I was friendly with Reed, and that was enough. Months, however, went on, and nothing came of it. One Sunday morning in winter, when our church bells were going for service, Major Perifer's carriage turned out with the ladies all in full figure. The Major himself turned out after it, walking, one of his daughters with him, a young man who was on a visit there, and a couple of servants. As they passed George Reed's, the sound of work being done in the garden at the back of the cottage caught the Major's quick ears. He turned softly down Piefinch Lane, stole on tiptoe to the high hedge, and stooped to peep through it. Reed was doing something to his turnips, hoeing them, the Major said. He called the gentleman to him and the two servants, and bade them look through the hedge. Nothing more. Then the party came on to church. On Tuesday, the Major rode out to take his place on the magisterial bench at Ulster. It was bitterly cold January weather, and only one magistrate besides himself was on it, a clergyman. 2 or 3 petty offenders were brought before them, who were severely sentenced, as prisoners always were when Major Perifer was presiding. Another magistrate came in afterwards. Singular to say, Todd and I had gone to the town that day about a new saddle for his horse. Singular on account of what happened. In saying we were there, I am telling the truth. It is not invented to give color to the tale. Upon turning out of the saddler's, which is near the justice room, old Jones the constable was coming along with a prisoner handcuffed, a tail after him. "Hello," cried Todd. "Here's fun." But I had seen what Todd did not, and rubbed my eyes, wondering if they saw double. "Todd, it is George Reed." Reed's face was as white as a sheet, and he walked along, not unwillingly, but as one in a state of sad shame, of awful rage. Todd made only one bound to the prisoner, and old Jones, knowing us, did not push him back again. As I'm a living man, I do not know what this is for, or why I am paraded through the town in disgrace, spoke Reed, in answer to Todd's question. If I'm charged with wrongdoing, I am willing to appear and answer for it, without being turned into a felon in the face and eyes of folks beforehand. Why do you bring Reed up in this manner, handcuffed? Demanded Todd of the constable. Because the Major told me to, young Mr. Todd Itley. Be you very sure? Todd pushed after them into the justice room. The police saw him, but he was a magistrate's son. The crowd would have liked to push in also, but were sent to the right about. I waited, and was presently admitted surreptitiously. Reed was standing before Major Perifer and the other two, handcuffed still, and I gathered what the charge was. It was preferred by Major Perifer, who had his servants there and a gentleman as witnesses. George Reed had been working in his garden on the previous Sunday morning, which was against the law. Old Jones had gone to Mr. Sterling's and taken him on the Major's warrant, as he was thrashing corn. Reed's answer was to the following effect. He was not working. His wife was ill, her little boy being only 4 days old, and Dr. Duffham ordered her some mutton broth. He went to the garden to get the turnips to put into it. It was only on account of her illness that he didn't go to church himself, he and Kathy. They might ask Dr. Duffham. Do you dare to tell me you were not hoeing turnips? Cried Major Perifer. I dare to say I was not doing it as work, independently answered the man. If you looked at me, as you say, Major, through the hedge, you must have seen the bunch of turnips I had got up, lying near. I took the hoe in my hand, and I did use it for 2 or 3 minutes. Some dead weeds had got thrown along the bed, by the children, perhaps, and I pulled them away. I went indoors directly. Before the clock struck 11, the turnips were on, boiling with the scrag of mutton. I peeled them and put them in myself. I see the bunch of turnips, cried one of the servants. They was lying. Hold your tongue, sir, roared his master. If your further evidence is wanted, you'll be asked for it. As to this defense, and the Major turned to his brother magistrates with a scornful smile, it is quite ingenious, one of the clever excuses we usually get here. But it will not serve your turn, George Reed. When the sanctity of the Sabbath is violated, Reed is not a man to say he did not do a thing if he did, interrupted Todd. The Major glared at him for an instant, and then put out of hand a big gold pencil he was waving majestically. Clear the room of spectators, said he to the policeman, which was all Todd got for interfering. We had to go out. And in a minute or two Reed came out also, handcuffed as before, not in charge of old Jones, but of the county police. He had been sentenced to a month's imprisonment. Major Perifer had wanted to make it 3 months. He said something about 6, but the other two thought they saw some slightly extenuating circumstances in the case. A solicitor who was intimate with the Sterlings and knew Reed very well had been present towards the end. "Could you not have spoken in my defense, sir?" asked Reed as he passed this gentleman in coming out. "Oh, had I been able. But you see, my man, when the law gets broken—" "The devil take the law," said Reed savagely. "What I want is justice, and the administrators of it are determined to uphold it. What can be said?" went on the solicitor equably, as if there had been no interruption. "You would make out that I broke the law just doing what I did, and I swear it was no more? That I can be legally punished for it? Don't read. It's of no use. The major and his witnesses swore you were at work, and it appears that you were. I asked them to take a fine if I must be punished. I might have found friends to advance it for me. Just so. And for that reason, of course, they did not take it," said the candid lawyer. "What is my wife to do while I am in prison? And the children? I may come out to find them starved. A month's long enough to starve them in such weather as this." Reed was allowed time for no more. He would not have been allowed that, but for having been jammed by the crowd at the doorway. He caught my eyes that were getting clear. "Master Johnny, will you go to the court for me? Your own place, sir, and tell the master that I swear I am innocent? Perhaps I'll let a few shillings go to the wife weekly. Tell him with my duty that I'll work it out as soon as I am released. All this is done out of revenge, sir, because Major Perifer couldn't get me from my cottage. May the Lord repay him. It caused a commotion, I can tell you, this imprisonment of Reed's. The place was ringing with it between the court and Dyke Manor. Our two houses seemed to have more to do with it than other people's. First, because Reed worked at the court. Secondly, because I, who owned both the court and the cottage, lived at the manor. People took it up pretty warmly, and Mrs. Reed and the children were cared for. Mr. Sterling paid her 5 shillings a week, and Mr. Brandon and the squire helped her on the quiet, and there were others also. In small country localities, gentlemen don't like to say openly that their neighbors are in the wrong. At any rate, they rarely do anything by way of remedy. Some spoke of an appeal to the Home Secretary, but it came to nothing, and no steps were taken to liberate Reed. Bill Whitney, who was staying a week with us, wrote and told his mother about it. She sent back a sovereign for Mrs. Reed. We 3 took it to her and went about saying old Perifer ought to be kicked, which was a relief to our feelings. But there's something to tell about Kathy. On the day that Reed was taken up, it was not known at his home immediately. The neighbors, aware that the wife was ill, said nothing to her, for old Duffham thought she was going to have a fever and ordered her to be kept quiet. For one thing, they did not know what there was to tell, except that Reed had been marched off from his work in handcuffs by Jones the constable. In the evening, when news came of his committal, it was agreed that an excuse should be made to Mrs. Reed that her husband had gone out on a business job for his master, and that Kathy, who could not fail to hear the truth from one or another, should be warned not to say anything. "Tell Kathy to come out here," said the woman, looking over the gate. It was the little girl they spoke to, who could talk well, and she answered that Kathy was not there. So, and Perkins, Mrs. Reed's sister, was called out. "Where's Kathy?" cried they. And Perkins answered in a passion that she did not know where Kathy was, but would uncommonly like to know, and she only wished she was behind her, keeping her there with her sister, when she ought to be at her own home. Then the women told in Perkins what they had intended to tell Kathy, and looked out for the latter. She did not come back. The night passed, and the next day passed, and Kathy was not seen or heard of. The only person who appeared to have met her was Goody Picker. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Tuesday, and Kathy had her best bonnet on. Mother Picker remarked upon her looking so smart, and asked where she was going to. Kathy answered that her uncle, who lived at Evesham, had sent to say she must go over there at once. But when she came to the 2 roads, she turned off quite on the contrary way to Evesham, and I thought the young woman must be daft, concluded Mrs. Picker. The month passed away, and Reed came out, but Kathy had not returned. He got home on foot in the afternoon, his hair cut close, and seemed as quiet as a lamb. The man had been daunted. It was an awful insult to put upon him, a slur on his good name for life, and some of them said George Reed would never hold up his head again. Had he been cruel or vindictive, he might have revenged himself on Major Perifer, personally, in a manner the Major would have found it difficult to forget. The wife was about again, but sickly. The little ones did not at first know their father. One of the first people he asked after was Kathy. The girl was not at hand to welcome him, and he took it in the light of a reproach. When men come for the first time out of jail, they are sensitive. Mr. Sterling called in yesterday, George, to say you were to go to your work again as soon as ever you came home, said the wife, evading the question about Kathy. Everybody has been so kind. They know you didn't deserve what you got. Ah, said Reed carelessly. Where's Kathy? Mrs. Reed felt obliged to tell him. No diplomatist, she brought out the news abruptly. Kathy had not been seen or heard of since the afternoon he was sent to prison. That aroused Reed. Nothing else seemed to have done it. And he got up from his chair. Why, where is she? What's become of her? The neighbors had been indulging in sundry speculations on the same question, which they had obligingly favored Mrs. Reed with. But she did not think it necessary to impart them to her husband. Kathy was a good girl on the whole, George, putting aside that she'd do no work and spend her time reading good-for-nothing books. What I think is this, that she heard of your misfortune after she left and wouldn't come home to face it. She is 18 now, you know. Come home from where? Mrs. Reed had to tell the whole truth. That Kathy, dressed up in her best things, had left home without saying a word to anyone, stealing out of the house unseen. She had been met in the road by Mrs. Picker and told her what has already been said. But the uncle at Evesham had seen nothing of her. Forgetting his cropped hair, as he would have to forget it until it should grow again, George Reed went tramping off, there and then, the nearly 2 miles of way to Mother Picker's. She could not tell him much more than he already knew. Kathy was all in her best, her curls oiled, and her pink ribbons as fresh as her cheeks, and said in answer to questions that she had been sent for sudden to her uncle's at Evesham, but she had turned off quite the contrary road. From thence, Reed walked on to his brother's at Evesham, and learnt that Kathy had not been sent for, and had not come. When Reed got home, he was dead beat. How many miles the man had walked that bleak February day, he did not stay to think, perhaps 20. When excitement buoys up the spirit, the body does not feel fatigue. Mrs. Reed put supper before her husband, and he ate mechanically, lost in thought. It fairly amazes me, he said presently in local phraseology. But for going out in her best, I should think some accident had come to her. There's ponds about, and young girls might slip in unawares. But the putting on her best things shows she was going somewhere. She put him on and went off unseen, repeated Mrs. Reed, snuffing the candle. I should have thought she'd maybe gone off to some wake. Only there wasn't one agate within range. Kathy had no bad acquaintance to lead her astray, he resumed. The girls about here are decent and mind their work, which Kathy didn't, thought Mrs. Reed. Kathy held her head above she said aloud. It's my belief she used to fancy herself one o' them fine ladies in her halfpenny books. She didn't seem to make acquaintance with nobody but that young Perifer. She talked to him by the hour together, and I couldn't get her indoors. Reed lifted his head. Young Perifer? What, his son? Turning his thumb in the direction of Perifer Hall. Kathy talked to him? By the hour together, reiterated Mrs. Reed. He'd be on that side the gate, talking and laughing and leaning on it. And Kathy, she'd be in the path by the tall hollyhocks, talking back to him and fondling the children. Reed rose up, a strange look on his face. How long was that going on? Ever so long. I can't just remember. But young Perifer is only at the hall by fits and starts. And you never told me, woman? I thought no harm of it. I don't think harm of it now, emphatically added Mrs. Reed. The worst of young Perifer that I've seen is that he's as soft as a tomtit. Reed put on his hat without another word and walked out. Late as it was, he was going to the hall. He rang a peal at it, more like a lord than a laborer just let out of prison. There was some delay in opening the door. The household had gone upstairs, but a man came at last. I want to see Major Perifer. The words were so authoritative, the man's appearance so strange, with his tall figure and his clipped hair, as he pushed forward into the hall, that the servant momentarily lost his wits. A light in a room on the left guided Reed. He entered it and found himself face to face with Major Perifer, who was seated in an easy chair before a good fire, spirits on the table, and a cigar in his mouth. What with the smoke from that? What with the faint light? For all the candles had been put out but one. The Major did not at first distinguish his late visitor's face. When the bare head and the resolute eyes met his, he certainly paled a little, and the cigar fell on to the carpet. "I want my daughter, Major Perifer." To hear a demand made for a daughter when the Major had possibly been thinking the demand might be for his life was undoubtedly a relief. It brought back his courage. "What do you mean, fellow?" he growled, stamping out the fire of the cigar. "Are you out of your mind?" "Not quite. You might have driven some men out of theirs, though, by what you've done. We'll let that part be, Major. I have come tonight about my daughter." "Where is she?" They stood looking at each other. Reed stood just inside the door, hat in hand. He did not forget his manners even in the presence of his enemy. They were a habit with him. The Major, who had risen in his surprise, stared at him. He really knew nothing whatever of the matter, not even that the girl was missing, and he did think Reed's imprisonment must have turned his brain. Perhaps Reed saw that he was not understood. "I come home from prison, into which you put me, Major Perifer, to find my daughter Catherine gone. She went away the day I was taken up. Where she went, or what she's doing, heaven knows. But you or yours are answerable for it, whichever way it may be." "You have been drinking," said Major Perifer. "You have, maybe," returned Reed, glancing at the spirits on the table. "Either Kathy went out on a harmless jaunt and is staying away because she can't face the shame at home which you have put there, or else she went out to meet your son and has been taken away by him. I think it must be the last. My fears whisper it to me. And if so, you can't be off knowing something of it. Major Perifer, I must have my daughter." Whether the hint given about his son alarmed the Major, causing him to forget his bluster for once, and answer civilly, he certainly did it. His son was in Ireland with his regiment, he said, had not been at the hall for weeks and weeks. He could answer for it that Lieutenant Perifer knew nothing of the girl. "He was here at Christmas," said George Reed. "I saw him, and left 2 or 3 days after it. How dare you, fellow, charge him with such a thing? He'd wring your neck for you if he were here. Perhaps I might find cause to wring his first. Major Perifer, I want my daughter. If you do not get out of my house, I'll have you brought before me tomorrow for trespassing, and give you a 2 month's imprisonment," roared the Major, gathering bluster and courage. "You want another month of it. This one does not appear to have done you the good it ought. Now go." "I'll go," said Reed, who began to see the Major really did not know anything of Kathy, and it had not been very probable that he did. "But I'd like to leave a word behind me. You have succeeded in doing me a great injury, Major Perifer. You are rich and powerful. I am poor and lowly. You set your mind on my bit of a home, and because you could not drive me from it, you took advantage of your magistrate's post to sentence me to prison, and so be revenged. It has done me a great deal of harm. What good has it done you?" Major Perifer could not speak for rage. "It will come home to you, sir. Mark me if it does not. God has seen my trouble and my wife's trouble, and I don't believe he ever let such a wrong pass unrewarded. It will come home to you, Major Perifer." George Reed went out, quietly shutting the hall door behind him, and walked home through the thick flakes of snow that had begun to fall.